Chapter 15. The Ransom. In the glory of the following morning, sparkling and clear after the storm, with an invigorating, briny tang in the air from the salt ponds on the south of the island, a curious scene was played on the beach of the Virgin Magra, at the foot of a ridge of bleached dunes, beside the spread of sail from which Levasseur had improvised a tent. Enthroned upon an empty cask sat the French filibuster to transact important business, the business of making himself safe with the governor of Tortuga. A guard of honor of a half-dozen officers hung about him. 5 of them were rude boucan hunters, in stained jerkins and leather breeches. The 6th was Cahusac. Before him, guarded by 2 half-naked Negroes, stood young d'Ogeron, in frilled shirt and satin small-clothes and fine shoes of Cordovan leather. He was stripped of doublet, and his hands were tied behind him. The young gentleman's comely face was haggard. Near at hand, and also under guard, but unpinioned, Mademoiselle his sister sat hunched upon a hillock of sand. She was very pale, and it was in vain that she sought to veil in a mask of arrogance the fears by which she was assailed. Levasseur addressed himself to M. d'Ogeron. He spoke at long length. In the end, "I trust, monsieur," said he with mock suavity, "that I have made myself quite clear, so that there may be no misunderstandings. I will recapitulate. Your ransom is fixed at 20,000 pieces of 8, and you shall have liberty on parole to go to Tortuga to collect it. In fact, I shall provide the means to convey you thither, and you shall have a month in which to come and go. Meanwhile, your sister remains with me as a hostage. Your father should not consider such a sum excessive as the price of his son's liberty, and to provide a dowry for his daughter. Indeed, if anything, I am too modest, pardi." M. d'Ogeron is reputed a wealthy man. M. d'Ogeron, the younger, raised his head and looked the captain boldly in the face. "I refuse utterly and absolutely. Do you understand? So do your worst, and be damned for a filthy pirate without decency and without honor." "But what words?" laughed Levasseur. "What heat and what foolishness! You have not considered the alternative. When you do, you will not persist in your refusal. You will not do that in any case. We have spurs for the reluctant. And I warn you against giving me your parole under stress, and afterwards playing me false. I shall know how to find and punish you. Meanwhile, remember, your sister's honor is in pawn to me. Should you forget to return with the dowry, you will not consider it unreasonable that I forget to marry her." Levasseur's smiling eyes, intent upon the young man's face, saw the horror that crept into his glance. M. d'Ogeron cast a wild glance at Mademoiselle and observed the gray despair that had almost stamped the beauty from her face. Disgust and fury swept across his countenance. Then he braced himself and answered resolutely, "No, you dog, 1,000 times no. You are foolish to persist." Levasseur spoke without anger, with a coldly mocking regret. His fingers had been busy tying knots in a length of whipcord. He held it up. "You know this. It is a rosary of pain that has wrought the conversion of many a stubborn heretic. It is capable of screwing the eyes out of a man's head by way of helping him to see reason. As you please." He flung the length of knotted cord to one of the Negroes, who in an instant made it fast about the prisoner's brows. Then, between cord and cranium, the black inserted a short length of metal, round and slender as a pipe-stem. That done, he rolled his eyes towards Levasseur, awaiting the captain's signal. Levasseur considered his victim, and beheld him tense and braced, his haggard face of a leaden hue, beads of perspiration glinting on his pallid brow just beneath the whipcord. Mademoiselle cried out, and would have risen, but her guards restrained her, and she sank down again, moaning. "I beg that you will spare yourself and your sister," said the captain, "by being reasonable. What, after all, is the sum I have named? To your wealthy father, a bagatelle. I repeat, I have been too modest. But since I have said 20,000 pieces of 8, 20,000 pieces it shall be. And for what, if you please, have you said 20,000 pieces of 8? In execrable French, but in a voice that was crisp and pleasant, seeming to echo some of the mockery that had invested Levasseurs, that question floated over their heads. Startled, Levasseur and his officers looked up and round. On the crest of the dunes behind them, in sharp silhouette against the deep cobalt of the sky, they beheld a tall, lean figure scrupulously dressed in black with silver lace, a crimson ostrich plume curled about the broad brim of his hat, affording the only touch of color. Under that hat was the tawny face of Captain Blood. Levasseur gathered himself up with an oath of amazement. He had conceived Captain Blood by now well below the horizon, on his way to Tortuga, assuming him to have been so fortunate as to have weathered last night's storm. Launching himself upon the yielding sand, into which he sank to the level of the calves of his fine boots of Spanish leather, Captain Blood came sliding erect to the beach. He was followed by Wolverstone and a dozen others. As he came to a standstill, he doffed his hat with a flourish to the lady. Then he turned to Levasseur. "Good morning, my captain," said he, and proceeded to explain his presence. "It was last night's hurricane compelled our return. We had no choice but to ride before it with stripped poles, and it drove us back the way we had gone. Moreover, as the devil would have it, the Santiago sprang her mainmast, and so I was glad to put into a cove on the west of the island a couple of miles away, and we've walked across to stretch our legs and to give you good day." "But who are these?" And he designated the man and the woman. Cahusac shrugged his shoulders and tossed his long arms to heaven. "Voila," said he pregnantly to the firmament. Levasseur gnawed his lip and changed color, but he controlled himself to answer civilly. "As you see, 2 prisoners. Ah, washed ashore in last night's gale, eh?" "Not so." Levasseur contained himself with difficulty before that irony. "They were in the Dutch brig. I don't remember that you mentioned them before." "I did not. They are prisoners of my own, a personal matter. They are French." "French?" Captain Blood's light eyes stabbed at Levasseur, then at the prisoners. M. d'Ogeron stood tense and braced as before, but the gray horror had left his face. Hope had leapt within him at this interruption, obviously as little expected by his tormentor as by himself. His sister, moved by a similar intuition, was leaning forward with parted lips and gaping eyes. Captain Blood fingered his lip and frowned thoughtfully upon Levasseur. "Yesterday you surprised me by making war upon the friendly Dutch, but now it seems that not even your own countrymen are safe from you. Have I not said that this is a matter personal to me?" "Ah, and their names?" Captain Blood's crisp, authoritative, faintly disdainful manner stirred Levasseur's quick anger. The blood crept slowly back into his blenched face, and his glance grew in insolence, almost in menace. Meanwhile, the prisoner answered for him. "I am Henri d'Augion, and this is my sister." "D'Ogeron?" Captain Blood stared. "Are you related by chance to my good friend the governor of Tortuga? He is my father." Levasseur swung aside with an imprecation. In Captain Blood, amazement for the moment quenched every other emotion. "The saints preserve us now. Are you quite mad, Levasseur? First you molest the Dutch, who are our friends. Next you take prisoners 2 persons that are French, your own countrymen. And now, faith, they're no less than the children of the governor of Tortuga, which is the one safe place of shelter that we enjoy in these islands." Levasseur broke in angrily. "Must I tell you again that it is a matter personal to me? I make myself alone responsible to the governor of Tortuga. And the 20,000 pieces of 8, is that also a matter personal to you?" "It is. Now I don't agree with you at all." Captain Blood sat down on the cask that Levasseur had lately occupied and looked up blandly. I may inform you, to save time, that I heard the entire proposal that you made to this lady and this gentleman, and I'll also remind you that we sail under articles that admit no ambiguities. You have fixed their ransom at 20,000 pieces of 8. That sum then belongs to your crews and mine in the proportions by the articles established. You'll hardly wish to dispute it, but what is far more grave is that you have concealed from me this part of the prizes taken on your last cruise, and for such an offense as that, the articles provide certain penalties that are something severe in character. Ho, ho, laughed Levasseur unpleasantly, then added, if you dislike my conduct, we can dissolve the association. That is my intention, but we'll dissolve it when and in the manner that I choose, and that will be as soon as you have satisfied the articles under which we sailed upon this cruise. What do you mean? I'll be as short as I can, said Captain Blood. I'll waive for the moment the unseemliness of making war upon the Dutch, of taking French prisoners, and of provoking the anger of the governor of Tortuga. I'll accept the situation as I find it. Yourself, you fixed the ransom of this couple at 20,000 pieces, and, as I gather, the lady is to be your perquisite. But why should she be your perquisite more than another's, seeing that she belongs by the articles to all of us as a prize of war? Black as thunder grew the brow of Levasseur. However, added Captain Blood, I'll not dispute her to you if you are prepared to buy her. Buy her? At the price you have set upon her. Levasseur contained his rage that he might reason with the Irishman. That is the ransom of the man. It is to be paid for him by the governor of Tortuga. No, no, ye've parcelled the twain together. Very oddly, I confess. Ye've set their value at 20,000 pieces, and for that sum you may have them, since you desire it. But you'll pay for them the 20,000 pieces that are ultimately to come to you as the ransom of one and the dowry of the other, and that sum shall be divided among our crews. So that you do that, it is conceivable that our followers may take a lenient view of your breach of the articles we jointly signed. Levasseur laughed savagely. Ah, ca, creed the good jest. I quite agree with you, said Captain Blood. To Levasseur, the jest lay in that Captain Blood, with no more than a dozen followers, should come there attempting to hector him who had 100 men within easy call. But it seemed that he had left out of his reckoning something which his opponent had counted in. For as, laughing still, Levasseur swung to his officers, he saw that which choked the laughter in his throat. Captain Blood had shrewdly played upon the cupidity that was the paramount inspiration of those adventurers, and Levasseur now read clearly on their faces how completely they adopted Captain Blood's suggestion that all must participate in the ransom which their leader had thought to appropriate to himself. It gave the gaudy ruffian pause, and whilst in his heart he cursed those followers of his who could be faithful only to their greed, he perceived, and only just in time, that he had best tread warily. You misunderstand, he said, swallowing his rage. The ransom is for division when it comes. The girl, meanwhile, is mine on that understanding. Good, grunted Cahusac. On that understanding, all arranges itself. You think so, said Captain Blood, but if M. d'Ogeron should refuse to pay the ransom, what then? He laughed and got lazily to his feet. No, no. If Captain Levasseur is meanwhile to keep the girl, as he proposes, then let him pay this ransom, and be his the risk if it should afterwards not be forthcoming. That's it, cried one of Levasseur's officers, and Cahusac added, It's reasonable that Captain Blood is right. It is in the articles. What is in the articles, you fools? Levasseur was in danger of losing his head. Sacre Dieu, where do you suppose that I have 20,000 pieces? My whole share of the prizes of this cruise does not come to half that sum. I'll be your debtor until I've earned it. Will that content you? All things considered, there is not a doubt that it would have done so had not Captain Blood intended otherwise. And if you should die before you have earned it, ours is a calling fraught with risks, my captain. Damn you! Levasseur flung upon him livid with fury. Will nothing satisfy you? Oh, but yes, 20,000 pieces of 8 for immediate division. I haven't got it. Then let someone buy the prisoners who has. And who do you suppose has it if I have not? I have, said Captain Blood. You have. Levasseur's mouth fell open. You want the girl? Why not? And I exceed you in gallantry in that I will make sacrifices to obtain her, and in honesty in that I am ready to pay for what I want. Levasseur stared at him foolishly agape. Behind him pressed his officers, gaping also. Captain Blood sat down again on the cask and drew from an inner pocket of his doublet a little leather bag. I am glad to be able to resolve a difficulty that at one moment seemed insoluble, and under the bulging eyes of Levasseur and his officers, he untied the mouth of the bag and rolled into his left palm 4 or 5 pearls, each of the size of a sparrow's egg. There were 20 such in the bag, the very pick of those taken in that raid upon the Pearl Fleet. You boast a knowledge of pearls, Cahusac. At what do you value this? The Breton took between coarse finger and thumb the proffered, lustrous, delicately iridescent sphere, his shrewd eyes appraising it. 1,000 pieces, he answered shortly. It will fetch rather more in Tortuga or Jamaica, said Captain Blood, and twice as much in Europe. But I'll accept your valuation. They are almost of a size, as you can see. Here are 12, representing 12,000 pieces of 8, which is La Foudre's share of 3/5 of the prize, as provided by the articles. For the 8,000 pieces that go to the Arabella, I make myself responsible to my own men. And now, Wolverstone, if you please, will you take my property aboard the Arabella? He stood up again, indicating the prisoners. Ah, no! Levasseur threw wide the floodgates of his fury. Ah, that, no, by example. You shall not take her. He would have sprung upon Captain Blood, who stood aloof, alert, tight-lipped, and watchful. But it was one of Levasseur's own officers who hindered him. Nom de Dieu, my captain, what will you do? It is settled, honorably settled with satisfaction to all. To all? Blazed Levasseur. Ah, ca, to all of you, you animals, but what of me? Cahusac, with the pearls clutched in his capacious hand, stepped up to him on the other side. Don't be a fool, Captain. Do you want to provoke trouble between the crews? His men outnumber us by nearly 2 to 1. What's a girl, more or less? In heaven's name, let her go. He's paid handsomely for her and dealt fairly with us. Dealt fairly? Roared the infuriated captain. You? In all his foul vocabulary, he could find no epithet to describe his lieutenant. He caught him a blow that almost sent him sprawling. The pearls were scattered in the sand. Cahusac dived after them, his fellows with him. Vengeance must wait. For some moments they groped there on hands and knees, oblivious of all else. And yet in those moments vital things were happening. Levasseur, his hand on his sword, his face a white mask of rage, was confronting Captain Blood to hinder his departure. You do not take her while I live, he cried. Then I'll take her when you're dead, said Captain Blood, and his own blade flashed in the sunlight. The articles provide that any man of whatever rank concealing any part of a prize, be it of the value of no more than a peso, shall be hanged at the yardarm. It's what I intended for you in the end. But since ye prefer it this way, ye muckrake, faith, I'll be humoring you. He waved away the men who would have interfered, and the blades rang together. M. Duogran looked on, a man bemused, unable to surmise what the issue either way could mean for him. Meanwhile, 2 of Blood's men who had taken the place of the Frenchman's Negro guards had removed the crown of whipcord from his brow. As for Mademoiselle, she had risen and was leaning forward, a hand pressed tightly to her heaving breast, her face deathly pale, a wild terror in her eyes. It was soon over. The brute strength upon which Levasseur so confidently counted could avail nothing against the Irishman's practiced skill. When, with both lungs transfixed, he lay prone on the white sand, coughing out his rascally life, Captain Blood looked calmly at Cahusac across the body. "I think that cancels the articles between us," he said. With soulless, cynical eyes, Cahusac considered the twitching body of his recent leader. Had Levasseur been a man of different temper, the affair might have ended in a very different manner. But, then, it is certain that Captain Blood would have adopted in dealing with him different tactics. As it was, Levasseur commanded neither love nor loyalty. The men who followed him were the very dregs of that vile trade, and cupidity was their only inspiration. Upon that cupidity Captain Blood had deftly played until he had brought them to find Levasseur guilty of the one offense they deemed unpardonable, the crime of appropriating to himself something which might be converted into gold and shared amongst them all. Thus now the threatening mob of buccaneers that came hastening to the theater of that swift tragi-comedy were appeased by a dozen words of Cahusac's. Whilst still they hesitated, Blood added something to quicken their decision. "If you will come to our anchorage, you shall receive at once your share of the booty of the Santiago, that you may dispose of it as you please." They crossed the island, the two prisoners accompanying them, and later that day, the division made, they would have parted company, but that Cahusac, at the instances of the men who had elected him Levasseur's successor, offered Captain Blood anew the services of that French contingent. "If you will sail with me again," the captain answered him, "you may do so on the condition that you make your peace with the Dutch and restore the brig and her cargo." The condition was accepted, and Captain Blood went off to find his guests, the children of the governor of Tortuga. Mademoiselle d'Ogeron and her brother, the latter now relieved of his bonds, sat in the great cabin of the Arabella, whither they had been conducted. Wine and food had been placed upon the table by Benjamin, Captain Blood's negro steward and cook, who had intimated to them that it was for their entertainment, but it had remained untouched. Brother and sister sat there in agonized bewilderment, conceiving that their escape was but from frying-pan to fire. At length, overwrought by the suspense, Mademoiselle flung herself upon her knees before her brother to implore his pardon for all the evil brought upon them by her wicked folly. M. d'Ogeron was not in a forgiving mood. "I am glad that at least you realize what you have done, and now this other filibuster has bought you, and you belong to him. You realize that, too, I hope." He might have said more, but he checked upon perceiving that the door was opening. Captain Blood, coming from settling matters with the followers of Levasseur, stood on the threshold. M. d'Ogeron had not troubled to restrain his high-pitched voice, and the captain had overheard the Frenchman's last two sentences. Therefore, he perfectly understood why Mademoiselle should bound up at sight of him and shrink back in fear. "Mademoiselle," said he in his vile but fluent French, "I beg you to dismiss your fears. Aboard this ship you shall be treated with all honor. So soon as we are in case to put to sea again, we steer a course for Tortuga to take you home to your father. And pray do not consider that I have bought you, as your brother has just said. All that I have done has been to provide the ransom necessary to bribe a gang of scoundrels to depart from obedience to the arch-scoundrel who commanded them, and so deliver you from all peril. Count it, if you please, a friendly loan to be repaid entirely at your convenience." Mademoiselle stared at him in unbelief. M. d'Ogeron rose to his feet. "Monsieur, is it possible that you are serious?" "I am. It may not happen often nowadays. I may be a pirate, but my ways are not the ways of Levasseur, who should have stayed in Europe and practiced purse-cutting. I have a sort of honor, shall we say, some rags of honor, remaining me from better days." Then, on a brisker note, he added, "We dine in an hour, and I trust that you will honor my table with your company. Meanwhile, Benjamin will see, monsieur, that you are more suitably provided in the matter of wardrobe." He bowed to them and turned to depart again, but Mademoiselle detained him. "Monsieur," she cried sharply. He checked and turned, whilst slowly she approached him, regarding him between dread and wonder. "Oh, you are noble." "I shouldn't put it as high as that myself," said he. You are, and it is but right that you should know all." "Madelon!" her brother cried out to restrain her, but she would not be restrained. Her surcharged heart must overflow in confidence. "Monsieur, for what befell I am greatly at fault. This man, this Levasseur." He stared, incredulous in his turn. My God, is it possible? That animal. Abruptly she fell on her knees, caught his hand and kissed it before he could wrench it from her. "What do?" he cried. "An amende. In my mind I dishonored you by deeming you his like, by conceiving your fight with Levasseur a combat between jackals. On my knees, monsieur, I implore you to forgive me." Captain Blood looked down upon her, and a smile broke on his lips, irradiating the blue eyes that looked so oddly light in that tawny face. "Why, child," said he, "I might find it hard to forgive you the stupidity of having thought otherwise." As he handed her to her feet again, he assured himself that he had behaved rather well in the affair. Then he sighed. That dubious fame of his that had spread so quickly across the Caribbean would by now have reached the ears of Arabella Bishop. That she would despise him, he could not doubt, deeming him no better than all the other scoundrels who drove this villainous buccaneering trade. Therefore, he hoped that some echo of this deed might reach her also, and be set by her against some of that contempt. For the whole truth, which he withheld from Mademoiselle d'Augion, was that in venturing his life to save her, he had been driven by the thought that the deed must be pleasing in the eyes of Miss Bishop, could she but witness it. Chapter 16. The Trap. That affair of Mademoiselle d'Ogeron bore as its natural fruit an improvement in the already cordial relations between Captain Blood and the governor of Tortuga. At the fine stone house, with its green jalousied windows, which M. d'Ogeron had built himself in a spacious and luxuriant garden to the east of Cayona, the captain became a very welcome guest. M. d'Ogeron was in the captain's debt for more than the 20,000 pieces of 8 which he had provided for Mademoiselle's ransom, and shrewd, hard bargain driver though he might be, the Frenchman could be generous and understood the sentiment of gratitude. This he now proved in every possible way, and under his powerful protection the credit of Captain Blood among the buccaneers very rapidly reached its zenith. So when it came to fitting out his fleet for that enterprise against Maracaibo, which had originally been Levasseur's project, he did not want for either ships or men to follow him. He recruited 500 adventurers in all, and he might have had as many thousands if he could have offered them accommodation. Similarly, without difficulty, he might have increased his fleet to twice its strength of ships, but that he preferred to keep it what it was. The 3 vessels to which he confined it were the Arabella, the La Foudre, which Cahusac now commanded with a contingent of some 60 Frenchmen, and the Santiago, which had been refitted and rechristened the Elizabeth. After that Queen of England, whose seamen had humbled Spain as captain, Blood now hoped to humble it again. Hagthorpe, in virtue of his service in the navy, was appointed by Blood to command her, and the appointment was confirmed by the men. It was some months after the rescue of Mademoiselle d'Ogeron, in August of that year 1687, that this little fleet, after some minor adventures which I pass over in silence, sailed into the great lake of Maracaibo and effected its raid upon that opulent city of the Main. The affair did not proceed exactly as was hoped, and Blood's force came to find itself in a precarious position. This is best explained in the words employed by Cahusac, which Pitt has carefully recorded, in the course of an altercation that broke out on the steps of the church of Nuestra Señora del Carmen, which Captain Blood had impiously appropriated for the purpose of a cour de garde. I have said already that he was a papist only when it suited him. The dispute was being conducted by Hagthorpe, Wolverstone, and Pitt on the one side, and Cahusac, out of whose uneasiness it all arose, on the other. Behind them, in the sun-scorched, dusty square, sparsely fringed by palms, whose fronds drooped listlessly in the quivering heat, surged a couple of hundred wild fellows belonging to both parties, their own excitement momentarily quelled so that they might listen to what passed among their leaders. Cahusac appeared to be having it all his own way, and he raised his harsh, querulous voice so that all might hear his truculent denunciation. He spoke, Pitt tells us, a dreadful kind of English, which the shipmaster, however, makes little attempt to reproduce. His dress was as discordant as his speech. It was of a kind to advertise his trade, and ludicrously in contrast with the sober garb of Hagthorpe and the almost foppish daintiness of Jeremy Pitt. His soiled and blood-stained shirt of blue cotton was open in front to cool his hairy breast, and the girdle about the waist of his leather breeches carried an arsenal of pistols and a knife, whilst a cutlass hung from a leather baldric loosely slung about his body. Above his countenance, broad and flat as a Mongolian's, a red scarf was swathed, turban-wise, about his head. "Is it that I have not warned you from the beginning that all was too easy?" he demanded between plaintiveness and fury. "I am no fool, my friends. I have eyes, me, and I see. I see an abandoned fort at the entrance of the lake, and nobody there to fire a gun at us when we came in. Then I suspect the trap. Who would not that had eyes and brain? Bah, we come on. What do we find? A city, abandoned like the fort, a city out of which the people have taken all things of value. Again, I warn Captain Blood. It is a trap, I say. We are to come on, always to come on, without opposition, until we find that it is too late to go to sea again, that we cannot go back at all. But no one will listen to me. You all know so much more. Name of God, Captain Blood, he will go on, and we go on. We go to Gibraltar. True that at last, after long time, we catch the deputy governor. True, we make him pay big ransom for Gibraltar. True, between that ransom and the loot, we return here with some 2,000 pieces of 8. But what is it in reality, will you tell me, or shall I tell you? It is a piece of cheese in a mousetrap, and we are the little mice. God damn, and the cats, oh, the cats, they wait for us. The cats are those 4 Spanish ships of war that have come meantime, and they wait for us outside the bottleneck of this lagoon. Mort de Dieu. That is what comes of the damned obstinacy of your fine Captain Blood. Wolverstone laughed. Cahusac exploded in fury. Ah, sang Dieu! Tu ris, animal? You laugh. Tell me this. How do we get out again unless we accept the terms of Monsieur the Admiral of Spain? From the buccaneers at the foot of the steps came an angry rumble of approval. The single eye of the gigantic Wolverstone rolled terribly, and he clenched his great fists as if to strike the Frenchman who was exposing them to mutiny. But Cahusac was not daunted. The mood of the men enheartened him. You think, perhaps, this your Captain Blood is the good God, that he can make miracles, eh? He is ridiculous, you know, this Captain Blood, with his grand air and his— He checked. Out of the church at that moment, grand air and all, sauntered Peter Blood. With him came a tough, long-legged French sea-wolf named Iberville, who, though still young, had already won fame as a privateer commander before the loss of his own ship had driven him to take service under Blood. The captain advanced towards that disputing group, leaning lightly upon his long ebony cane, his face shaded by a broad plumed hat. There was in his appearance nothing of the buccaneer. He had much more the air of a lounger in the Mall or the Alameda, the latter, rather, since his elegant suit of violet taffetas with gold-embroidered buttonholes was in the Spanish fashion. But the long, stout, serviceable rapier, thrust up behind by the left hand resting lightly on the pommel, corrected the impression. That and those steely eyes of his announced the adventurer. "You find me ridiculous, eh, Cahusac?" said he, as he came to a halt before the Breton, whose anger seemed already to have gone out of him. "What, then, must I find you?" He spoke quietly, almost wearily. "You will be telling them that we have delayed, and that it is the delay that has brought about our danger. But whose is the fault of that delay? We have been a month in doing what should have been done, and what, but for your blundering, would have been done inside of a week. Nom de Dieu! Was it my fault was it anyone else's fault that you ran your ship La Foudre aground on the shoal in the middle of the lake? You would not be piloted. You knew your way. You took no soundings even. The result was that we lost 3 precious days in getting canoes to bring off your men and your gear. Those 3 days gave the folk at Gibraltar not only time to hear of our coming, but time in which to get away. After that, and because of it, we had to follow the governor to his infernal island fortress, and a fortnight and best part of 100 lives were lost in reducing it. That's how we come to have delayed until this Spanish fleet is fetched round from La Guaira by a Gauda Costa, and if ye hadn't lost La Foudre and so reduced our fleet from 3 ships to 2, we should even now be able to fight our way through with a reasonable hope of succeeding. Yet you think it is for you to come hectoring here, upbraiding us for a situation that is just the result of your own ineptitude." He spoke with a restraint which I trust you will agree was admirable when I tell you that the Spanish fleet guarding the bottleneck exit of the great Lake of Maracaibo and awaiting there the coming forth of Captain Blood with a calm confidence based upon its overwhelming strength was commanded by his implacable enemy, Don Miguel de Espinosa y Valdez, the Admiral of Spain. In addition to his duty to his country, the Admiral had, as you know, a further personal incentive arising out of that business aboard the Encarnacion a year ago and the death of his brother Don Diego, and with him sailed his nephew Esteban, whose vindictive zeal exceeded the Admiral's own. Yet, knowing all this, Captain Blood could preserve his calm in reproving the cowardly frenzy of one for whom the situation had not half the peril with which it was fraught for himself. He turned from Cahusac to address the mob of buccaneers who had surged nearer to hear him, for he had not troubled to raise his voice. "I hope that will correct some of the misapprehension that appears to have been disturbing you," said he. "There's no good can come of talking of what's past and done," cried Cahusac, more sullen now than truculent, whereupon Wolverstone laughed, a laugh that was like the neighing of a horse. "The question is, what are we to do now?" "Sure now, there's no question at all," said Captain Blood. "Indeed, but there is," Cahusac insisted. "Don Miguel, the Spanish admiral, have offered us safe passage to sea if we will depart at once, do no damage to the town, release our prisoners, and surrender all that we took at Gibraltar." Captain Blood smiled quietly, knowing precisely how much Don Miguel's word was worth. It was Iberville who replied in manifest scorn of his compatriot, which argues that, even at this disadvantage as he has us, the Spanish admiral is still afraid of us. "That can be only because he not know our real weakness," was the fierce retort, "and anyway, we must accept these terms. We have no choice. That is my opinion." "Well, it's not mine now," said Captain Blood, "so I've refused them." "Refused?" Cahusac's broad face grew purple. A muttering from the men behind enheartened him. "You have refused? You have refused already, and without consulting me?" "Your disagreement could have altered nothing. You'd have been outvoted, for Hagthorpe here was entirely of my own mind." Still, he went on, if you and your own French followers wish to avail yourselves of the Spaniards' terms, we shall not hinder you. Send one of your prisoners to announce it to the admiral. Don Miguel will welcome your decision, you may be sure. Cahusac glowered at him in silence for a moment. Then, having controlled himself, he asked in a concentrated voice, "Precisely what answer have you make to the admiral?" A smile irradiated the face and eyes of Captain Blood. "I have answered him that unless within 24 hours we have his parole to stand out to sea, ceasing to dispute our passage or hinder our departure, and a ransom of 50,000 pieces of 8 for Maracaibo, we shall reduce this beautiful city to ashes, and thereafter go out and destroy his fleet." The impudence of it left Cahusac speechless. But among the English buccaneers in the square, there were many who savored the audacious humor of the trapped dictating terms to the trappers. Laughter broke from them. It spread into a roar of acclamation, for bluff is a weapon dear to every adventurer. Presently, when they understood it, even Cahusac's French followers were carried off their feet by that wave of jocular enthusiasm, until, in his truculent obstinacy, Cahusac remained the only dissentient. He withdrew in mortification, nor was he to be mollified until the following day brought him his revenge. This came in the shape of a messenger from Don Miguel with a letter in which the Spanish admiral solemnly vowed to God that, since the pirates had refused his magnanimous offer to permit them to surrender with the honors of war, he would now await them at the mouth of the lake, there to destroy them on their coming forth. He added that, should they delay their departure, he would so soon as he was reinforced by a 5th ship, the Santo Niño, on its way to join him from La Guaira, himself come inside to seek them at Maracaibo. This time, Captain Blood was put out of temper. "Trouble me no more," he snapped at Cahusac, who came growling to him again. "Send word to Don Miguel that you have seceded from me. He'll give you safe conduct, devil a doubt. Then take one of the sloops, order your men aboard and put to sea, and the devil go with you." Cahusac would certainly have adopted that course if only his men had been unanimous in the matter. They, however, were torn between greed and apprehension. If they went, they must abandon their share of the plunder, which was considerable, as well as the slaves and other prisoners they had taken. If they did this, and Captain Blood should afterwards contrive to get away unscathed, and, from their knowledge of his resourcefulness, the thing, however unlikely, need not be impossible, he must profit by that which they now relinquished. This was a contingency too bitter for contemplation. And so, in the end, despite all that Cahusac could say, the surrender was not to Don Miguel, but to Peter Blood. They had come into the venture with him, they asserted, and they would go out of it with him or not at all. That was the message he received from them that same evening by the sullen mouth of Cahusac himself. He welcomed it, and invited the Breton to sit down and join the council, which was even then deliberating upon the means to be employed. This council occupied the spacious patio of the governor's house, which Captain Blood had appropriated to his own uses, a cloistered stone quadrangle in the middle of which a fountain played coolly under a trellis of vine. Orange trees grew on 2 sides of it, and the still evening air was heavy with the scent of them. It was one of those pleasant exterior-interiors which Moorish architects had introduced to Spain and the Spaniards had carried with them to the New World. Here that council of war, composed of 6 men in all, deliberated until late that night upon the plan of action which Captain Blood put forward. The great freshwater lake of Maracaibo, nourished by a score of rivers from the snow-capped ranges that surround it on 2 sides, is some 120 miles in length and almost the same distance across at its widest. It is, as has been indicated, in the shape of a great bottle having its neck towards the sea at Maracaibo. Beyond this neck it widens again, and then the 2 long, narrow strips of land, known as the islands of Vigilias and Palomas, block the channel, standing lengthwise across it. The only passage out to sea for vessels of any draught lies in the narrow strait between these islands. Palomas, which is some 10 miles in length, is unapproachable for half a mile on either side by any but the shallowest craft save at its eastern end, where, completely commanding the narrow passage out to sea, stands the massive fort which the buccaneers had found deserted upon their coming. In the broader water between this passage and the bar, the 4 Spanish ships were at anchor in mid-channel. The Admiral's Encarnacion, which we already know, was a mighty galleon of 48 great guns and 8 small. Next in importance was the Salvador with 36 guns. The other 2, the Infanta and the San Felipe, though smaller vessels, were still formidable enough with their 20 guns and 150 men apiece. Such was the fleet of which the Gauntlet was to be run by Captain Blood with his own Arabella of 40 guns, the Elizabeth of 26, and 2 sloops captured at Gibraltar, which they had indifferently armed with 4 culverins each. In men, they had a bare 400 survivors of the 500-odd that had left Tortuga to oppose to fully 1,000 Spaniards manning the galleons. The plan of action submitted by Captain Blood to that council was a desperate one, as Cahusac uncompromisingly pronounced it. "Why, so it is," said the captain, "but I've done things more desperate." Complacently he pulled at a pipe that was loaded with that fragrant sacerdote's tobacco for which Gibraltar was famous, and of which they had brought away some hogsheads. And what is more, they've succeeded. Audaces fortuna juvat. Bedad, they knew their world, the old Romans. He breathed into his companions, and even into Cahusac, some of his own spirit of confidence, and in confidence all went busily to work. For 3 days from sunrise to sunset, the buccaneers labored and sweated to complete the preparations for the action that was to procure them their deliverance. Time pressed. They must strike before Don Miguel de Espinosa received the reinforcement of that 5th galleon, the Santo Niño, which was coming to join him from La Guaira. Their principal operations were on the larger of the 2 sloops captured at Gibraltar, to which vessel was assigned the leading part in Captain Blood's scheme. They began by tearing down all bulkheads until they had reduced her to the merest shell, and in her sides they broke open so many ports that her gunwale was converted into the semblance of a grating. Next, they increased by 6 the scuttles in her deck, whilst into her hull they packed all the tar and pitch and brimstone that they could find in the town, to which they added 6 barrels of gunpowder, placed on end like guns at the open ports on her larboard side. On the evening of the 4th day, everything being now in readiness, all were got aboard, and the empty, pleasant city of Maracaibo was at last abandoned. But they did not weigh anchor until some 2 hours after midnight. Then, at last, on the first of the ebb, they drifted silently down towards the bar with all canvas furled save only their spilt sails, which, so as to give them steering way, were spread to the faint breeze that stirred through the purple darkness of the tropical night. The order of their going was as follows. Ahead went the improvised fire-ship in charge of Wolverstone, with a crew of 6 volunteers, each of whom was to have 100 pieces of 8 over and above his share of plunder as a special reward. Next came the Arabella. She was followed at a distance by the Elizabeth, commanded by Hagthorpe, with whom was the now shipless Cahusac and the bulk of his French followers. The rear was brought up by the 2nd sloop and some 8 canoes, aboard of which had been shipped the prisoners, the slaves, and most of the captured merchandise. The prisoners were all pinioned and guarded by 4 buccaneers with musketoons who manned these boats, in addition to the 2 fellows who were to sail them. Their place was to be in the rear, and they were to take no part whatever in the coming fight. As the first glimmerings of opalescent dawn dissolved the darkness, the straining eyes of the buccaneers were able to make out the tall rigging of the Spanish vessels, riding at anchor less than 1/4 of a mile ahead. Entirely without suspicion as the Spaniards were, and rendered confident by their own overwhelming strength, it is unlikely that they used a vigilance keener than their careless habit. Certain it is that they did not sight Blood's fleet in that dim light until some time after Blood's fleet had sighted them. By the time that they had actively roused themselves, Wolverstone's sloop was almost upon them, speeding under canvas which had been crowded to her yards the moment the galleons had loomed into view. Straight for the Admiral's great ship, the Encarnacion, did Wolverstone head the sloop. Then, lashing down the helm, he kindled from a match that hung ready lighted beside him a great torch of thickly plaited straw that had been steeped in bitumen. First it glowed, then as he swung it round his head it burst into flame, just as the slight vessel went crashing and bumping and scraping against the side of the flagship, whilst rigging became tangled with rigging, to the straining of yards and snapping of spars overhead. His 6 men stood at their posts on the larboard side, stark naked, each armed with a grapnel, 4 of them on the gunwale, 2 of them aloft. At the moment of impact, these grapnels were slung to bind the Spaniard to them, those aloft being intended to complete and preserve the entanglement of the rigging. Aboard the rudely awakened galleon, all was confused, hurrying, scurrying, trumpeting, and shouting. At first, there had been a desperately hurried attempt to get up the anchor, but this was abandoned as being already too late, and conceiving themselves on the point of being boarded, the Spaniards stood to arms to ward off the onslaught. Its slowness in coming intrigued them, being so different from the usual tactics of the buccaneers. Further intrigued were they by the sight of the gigantic Wolverstone speeding naked along his deck with a great flaming torch held high. Not until he had completed his work did they begin to suspect the truth, that he was lighting slow matches, and then one of their officers, rendered reckless by panic, ordered a boarding party on to the shop. The order came too late. Wolverstone had seen his 6 fellows drop overboard after the grapnels were fixed, and then had sped, himself, to the starboard gunwale. Thence he flung his flaming torch down the nearest gaping scuttle into the hold, and thereupon dived overboard in his turn, to be picked up presently by the longboat from the Arabella. But before that happened, the sloop was a thing of fire, from which explosions were hurling blazing combustibles aboard the Encarnacion, and long tongues of flame were licking out to consume the galleon, beating back those daring Spaniards who, too late, strove desperately to cut her adrift. And whilst the most formidable vessel of the Spanish fleet was thus being put out of action at the outset, Blood had sailed in to open fire upon the Salvador. First, athwart her hawse, he had loosed a broadside that had swept her decks with terrific effect. Then, going on and about, he had put a second broadside into her hull at short range. Leaving her thus half-crippled, temporarily at least, and keeping to his course, he had bewildered the crew of the Infanta by a couple of shots from the chasers on his beakhead, then crashed alongside to grapple and board her, whilst Hagthorpe was doing the like by the San Felipe. And in all this time not a single shot had the Spaniards contrived to fire, so completely had they been taken by surprise, and so swift and paralyzing had been Blood's stroke. Boarded now and faced by the cold steel of the buccaneers, neither the San Felipe nor the Infanta offered much resistance. The sight of their admiral in flames and the Salvador drifting crippled from the action had so utterly disheartened them that they accounted themselves vanquished and laid down their arms. If by a resolute stand the Salvador had encouraged the other 2 undamaged vessels to resistance, the Spaniards might well have retrieved the fortunes of the day. But it happened that the Salvador was handicapped in true Spanish fashion by being the treasure ship of the fleet, with plate on board to the value of some 50,000 pieces. Intent above all upon saving this from falling into the hands of the pirates, Don Miguel, who, with a remnant of his crew, had meanwhile transferred himself aboard her, headed her down towards Palomas and the fort that guarded the passage. This fort the admiral, in those days of waiting, had taken the precaution secretly to garrison and rearm. For the purpose he had stripped the fort of Cogero, farther out on the Gulf, of its entire armament, which included some cannon royal of more than ordinary range and power. With no suspicion of this, Captain Blood gave chase, accompanied by the Infanta, which was manned now by a prize crew under the command of Iberville. The stern chasers of the Salvador desultorily returned the punishing fire of the pursuers, but such was the damage she, herself, sustained that presently, coming under the guns of the fort, she began to sink and finally settled down in the shallows with part of her hull above water. Thence, some in boats, and some by swimming, the admiral got his crew ashore on Palomas as best he could. And then, just as Captain Blood accounted the victory won, and that his way out of that trap to the open sea beyond lay clear, the fort suddenly revealed its formidable and utterly unsuspected strength. With a roar the cannons royal proclaimed themselves, and the Arabella staggered under a blow that smashed her bulwarks at the waist and scattered death and confusion among the seamen gathered there. Had not Pitt, her master, himself seized the whipstaff and put the helm hard over to swing her sharply off to starboard, she must have suffered still worse from the second volley that followed fast upon the first. Meanwhile, it had fared even worse with the frailer Infanta. Although hit by one shot only, this had crushed her larboard timbers on the waterline, starting a leak that must presently have filled her, but for the prompt action of the experienced Iberville in ordering her larboard guns to be flung overboard. Thus lightened, and listing now to starboard, he fetched her about, and went staggering after the retreating Arabella, followed by the fire of the fort, which did them, however, little further damage. Out of range, at last, they lay to, joined by the Elizabeth and the San Felipe, to consider their position.